Good evening, everybody. I'm really happy that so many of you showed up because, to be honest, I picked this topic for very selfish reasons. And the reason was that I always regretted that I haven't experienced Prague in 1990s and its lost beauties. And as Christoph said, I was too young. I came theoretically still in the 90s, but it was September 1999. And you could feel it a little bit in the air, like the atmosphere and a little bit of that. But you could also tell that the period was basically definitively gone, and it basically exchanged Prague for more organized, more business-oriented, less adventurous city. What I want to do today is to look at Prague through three personal stories, namely the story of André Fenton, of Maura Griffin and Rob Lewis, who will be our today's speakers. So I need to make a disclaimer. We will by no means give a complex picture of Prague in 1990s. It's quite possible if you lived there, your experience was different. Before we start to elicit the atmosphere of 1990s, I prepared a few pictures from the time for you, which we will now go through. As you can see, Prague was definitely not as colorful, not as renovated as it is these days. But it definitely had its magic, especially if you went a little bit off the beaten path. In this picture, you can see there are still the old buses, the trams which are still operating, I think, until these days, the old subway cars made in Russia. And the interesting thing is that picture of the main station, Hlavní nádraží. The information table is primarily in Russian, German, no mention of English whatsoever, which is probably very different from what you would see these days. And then also the fashion was very different, as you can see here from these pictures. And what I find fascinating, even male fashion had its exciting parts, especially in the picture on the right. So that was just to give you an idea how people dressed, how Prague looked. And then many events happened, especially in early 90s in Prague, which were symbols of our country being opening its borders. So in April 1990, Pope John Paul II came, he kissed the ground, he shook hands with Václav Havel, which was big thing for many people. For different sort of people, maybe Rolling Stones coming to Prague in August 1990 was again a milestone. There was this saying, kameny se valí do Prahy, stones are rolling into Prague. And there is a say that it was Havel who invited them, but that's not actually true. They invited themselves. They sent a letter asking, offering to do a concert there. And then in November 1990, George Bush, the American president, came to Prague, which was another big thing. And then in 1991, in June, Frank Zappa had a concert, and he gave this almost emotional proclamation toward the Czech audience, where he said something it's the first time he had a reason to play his guitar in 3 years, and he really appeal to Czechs to stay as unique as they are right now, as he perceived it when he was there. And a few weeks later, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. So again, a big event. And then probably for the most people, what 1990s is symbolized by what they associate, if you say 1990s Prague, is the club scene. Because there were so many of these rock clubs and other clubs which were opening, they were growing as mushrooms after rain, as we have this saying in Czech. And I think the most famous from them was probably Bunker Club, which existed for about 6 years. And it was even voted one of the top 10 European rock clubs. And unfortunately, it had to be closed due to complaints from neighbors because of the noise. The first one which was opened after the Velvet Revolution was Rock Café in 1990. It's still open today on Národní třída. And right next to it, there is Jazz Club Reduta. That one is much older, it's from 50s, but it became famous especially in 1994 when Bill Clinton had this impromptu performance there because he was gifted with a saxophone and he played it there without being really ready for that. And then I should also mention Klub Sedmička, which was on Block 7 in Strahov, dormitory, basically. So it was a very small club, still active until today, very it seems it still has lots of strength. And then we shouldn't forget about Roxy, which started in 1991. And also the infamous Disco and Sylvia. I'm not sure how many of you have heard about it, but it was the place where Czech pop stars like rubbed shoulders with members of Czech mafia. And we could talk the whole evening only about that person in the picture, Jonak, and everything, but that's not what we are here for today. But it's definitely one of the things which also characterized the cultural scene at the time, cultural, political, and so on. So I did this only to really give you this context into which our three guests came. Two more things. In February 1992, Prague went online at the Czech Technical University. They connected to the internet for the first time. And in December 1992, Prague's historic district was listed among the UNESCO's World Heritage Sites. And that was like that, and much more was happening. Many, not only famous people, but also regular citizens of the United States of America and many other countries were coming. And we will hear here why and what motivated them. So I will now give the floor to them in the order in which they came to Prague. So the first one was André, who came in 1991, then Maura in 1992, and Rob in 1993. And they will first tell us a little bit about themselves, what they do now, what brought them to Prague, why did they go there, for how long. And after they give their 5-minute intro, each of them will have opportunity to ask them more questions, which I already prepared. And then at the end, I'll ask you if you have any further questions as well.
So what I do today is I'm a neuroscientist. I'm at the Center for Neuroscience at NYU. I study how brains store information and how you can retrieve that information, or how mice and rats, at least, can retrieve that information from their neurons without confusing themselves with everything that's in their brain. And I study really the nuts and bolts of what makes up thought and memory. And I suppose the reason I do that is because I went to Prague. There were a couple of reasons I went to Prague. The one that I remember most is I went to study neurobiology. I had been I'm Canadian, so I'm actually, a fake American. And while I was at McGill, I became interested in neuroscience, studying crickets and how crickets listen for bats. And that happens to be super interesting if you don't believe me. And at some point I decided that I wanted to continue doing this. And it was recommended that I go to Prague because there was a famous neurophysiologist there. I knew this person was famous because he had written books that I had never read, and there was no internet at the time, so I couldn't verify that. But I wrote to him saying, "I'm amazing, you should hire me," and he did. And I didn't realize what the bargain was at the time. So that's me in the lab in those early days. The crazy thing about this laboratory was a famous Czech, in fact, international laboratory, and it was filled with people from around the world, myself being one of them. She was from Argentina. Maria is her name. It's a good guess, given she's from Argentina, but I think it's actually her name. And I worked in the lab. But Jan Bursch was, like many Czechs that I met, extremely resourceful. And so what he had engineered is that I would teach English at ČVUT, at the Czech Technical University. And the reason for that was so that I could get housing, because they had really good housing if you had some affiliation there. And his daughter was in the cybernetics department there. So he arranged that I would teach English there, and I like to believe that I was the worst English teacher ever in the Czech Republic. I had no qualifications. I even fell asleep teaching to the faculty at the university. My real reason for being there was to learn to do science, which Jan taught me, and he is an internationally recognized He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences here in the US, and many people from around the world went to Prague just to talk to him for a day, for an afternoon. They traveled all around the world, and he was such an inspiring figure, in particular because he had this really can-do approach to doing science. Instead of applying for a grant and getting a ton of money and then organizing things, he just said, let's do that, and we would figure out how to build things. So through his interventions, I learned to be an engineer. I'm a biomedical engineer now. I founded a company that makes medical devices with zero training, zero appropriate training, but I got trained at Jan's knee and his engineers' knees. And so that is more or less the brief version of the story that got me here. One of the things I really appreciated about being in Prague is I could afford to not live my life. So her name is Vera, and she took care of me, basically. So Vera took over my apartment, and she cleaned it and fixed it and bought things that I needed. If my clothes needed mending, she would mend them. She would build bookshelves when I just had books on the floor. I'd come home after the weekend and she'd had her husband come and build bookshelves and so on. And so I felt incredible. I felt like a lucky monk in some sense, because I could focus on doing science, and I spent a lot of time doing that. But
and
the rest of my life, teaching
English,
Czech
sorry.
I wasn't so good at, and that I managed not to do after not too long. But I was able to really focus on what was important to me, and other people helped me do that. And there was a easy infrastructure because I could trust people, and they trusted me, and we all felt like we were doing something to make this place better. And she was she volunteered to do this. She's somebody who is a relative of someone who works at the Institute.
Wow.
I spent 18 months in Prague. I was supposed to be there for 6 months, and the very first thing that Jan said to me when he met me at the airport was, there's no point in you learning Czech. English is the international language of science. You're only going to be here 6 months. And every time I thought, I'm only going to be here 6 months. So I never actually learned Czech. I left, I came to New York, did a PhD. Jan recruited me to come back and organize his laboratory, and I spent until 2005 there for on and off. Again, never thinking I'd really need to learn Czech, which I never really properly learned. So I think that brings me up to date.
So my name is Maura Griffin, and I was a journalist before I came to Prague. I was working for the Associated Press in Vermont, and there were so many exciting things happening around the world. Tiananmen Square was falling, and I thought, what am I doing in Montpelier, Vermont? So I talked to some people who said there's an English language paper in Prague, which had just started up, called the Prague Post. And I talked to some people there, and they said, just come on over. We'd love somebody who's got some experience, because most kids were coming right out of college. I had a couple of years of experience. And so that's what I did. And I went and I worked at the Prague Post and met a bunch of people and wrote several stories. And what we did, sitting around after hours, drinking beer, thinking about things that would be great to have in Prague. And one of them was an English language bookstore and coffeehouse, which was just starting up in the States, and it was so cool and cozy, and there was nothing like that in Prague. And in fact, to get an English language book in Prague, you had to take out a loan to get it for most backpackers and people who were there, students. So that's what we did. We got together, Jasper Bear, Mark Baker, and I started putting together the idea of the Globe in '92, and basically with a little bit of seed money from all of our families, we started the Globe. There were two others who came on who had started Radost, which I don't know if any of you remember, also a very famous expat place. So they had experience with the kitchen part of things. So we merged the bookstore idea with the kitchen. So we actually ended up having much more than just coffee and snacks. We had American salads, we had peanut butter and jelly, sandwiches, we had ice, we had an ice machine, we had an espresso machine. So it was kind of a home away from home for a lot of people. Some people who'd lived there a long time and weren't part of the expat scene. There was a bit of disdain for people who wanted a taste of back home. But there were a lot of Czechs too, especially young Czechs, who loved to come in and wanted to read books that they'd read in Czech by Ludvík Vasilík, and then they could read it in English translation and they could come and talk about it. It was before internet, really, and before email. So what the Globe became at that time was a hub. It was a center. And I've talked to so many people who say that they met their spouses, that it was a meaningful experience there. This was Thanksgiving. That was a couple of the founders. There was also a time when, one of the reasons there was so much press was, of course, Clinton in '94. But there was a lot of interest in Americans in Prague at the time. So we were the lucky beneficiary of a lot of that press, which certainly helped the business. We were in guidebooks, like in 6 months. The building had been a prani pradla, which is basically a communist laundromat. Before that, it had actually been a somewhat grand pharmacy. At one point, we found pictures of it, but it had gone downhill as a laundromat. So we had a lot of work to do. We did open it up in July of '93. So what I do now is you could say entirely different than what I was doing then, but it has an entrepreneurial bent to it. I have my own firm called Blue Spark Financial. I manage money and do financial planning, mostly for women in transition, divorce, widowhood, retirement. It came out of that in a certain way, but it's too long to talk about now.
So that's me in the top left corner a lot of gray hairs ago. I was a 26-year-old graduate student at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. It was the summer between my 2 years of my master's program, and I was trying to figure out what the heck to do with myself. I had this notion that someday I might go into the Foreign Service. That's kind of what the Fletcher School traditionally prepared people to do. So I applied for a State Department internship, and lo and behold, I hit the lottery and I wound up in Prague, considering that some of my classmates wound up in Micronesia and other places like that. And so I just felt like the luckiest guy in the world, because I was aware that Prague was pretty much considered the coolest city in the world at that time. So off I went, and I was very fortunate to be entrusted with, looking back, I'm still amazed to this day that they entrusted me with the responsibilities that I had, which was to basically write cables and analytical reports on economic issues of interest to the U.S. government. So I was assigned to the economics section, and I worked for a wonderful guy there, a career Foreign Service officer by the name of Russ Trowbridge. And I think the thing that impressed me most about the Foreign Service officers in Prague was that they all had to master the Czech language. They had to learn how to speak it. And Russ was on about his 8th language. He had just gotten Norwegian down, and he got sent to Prague. So now he was, trying to learn his declensions and all that. But he was actually, I would sit in meetings with him as a note taker with various, Czech government officials, and he would speak this Midwestern accented, or I think he might have been originally Canadian, who then got dual citizenship. But in any case, he conducted himself in these meetings in Czech, which just blew me away. I was just amazed. So I got to do a lot of interesting things. My time in Prague was comparatively brief, but what it lacked in time, it sort of made up for in intensity. So I did things like they sent me with a U.S. nuclear scientist to observe, to check out the construction of a new nuclear plant called Temelin in the countryside. I don't, still looking back, understand quite what my purpose was there. Maybe to keep the guy out of trouble. I don't know. But, I wrote about wage controls and pretty dry stuff. Privatization. There was a massive, large-scale privatization program going on at the time in the country, and I did some work on that. You know, it was a great time to be a Foreign Service officer in Prague. The Czechs were. It was 4 years after the country. After the Velvet Revolution. It was 4 months after the country had split into Czech Republic and Slovakia. So I was working for the first U.S. ambassador to the Czech Republic, a gentleman by the name of Adrian Basora. And the Czech Republic was eager to engage the U.S. as a partner, as a sort of counterbalance to the heavy investment that Germany was making and the Netherlands. And so the U.S. was, I think, the third largest foreign investor in the country in the 90s, and it was really all about business development. I mean, there wasn't a lot of, there wasn't any strife, there wasn't any violence, and some of the Foreign Service officers I had worked with before, who had been in hot spots like Lebanon and other places, they were a little bit bored, quite frankly. But it was a fun place to be. I mean, when I wasn't working on things like that, I was out at night, exploring many of the places we just saw up on the screen. So it was a different perspective from the typical American expat. It was a privilege to have that trust from the embassy, and it helped me in my future role, my future job, which I'm a speechwriter now. I'm a corporate speechwriter. I was a political speechwriter before this. And I learned a lot about how to write at the State Department. It was a very disciplined form of writing. You had to really distill issues down for consumption by Washington and by others. And it helped me as a writer to develop. So I'm grateful for that period.
So I remember my very first evening in Prague. We were in Staromecka, and it was, I think, in January or so. 1991. And what was amazing was it looked yellow, because all of the lights, and there was a haze. I later came to call it the lid, as if a lid had been put on the city. But there was this beautiful yellow haze, and it looked, gorgeous to me. It felt like I was in a painting or something like that. Wow. Little did I realize it was smog. Yeah. And there was a distinctive smell that produced the smog, the coal. And there were very few people. And I remember sort of marching across the square on the cobblestones, and it just looked like I was in a fairy tale. Mm-hmm. I remember feeling that wow, this is a fairy tale adventure that is about to begin. Yeah. I absolutely remember it that way. And we were in search of a restaurant, and that was how the adventure began. We couldn't find a place to really eat that night.
I remember that coal smell very well, and I remember saying to someone, "Oh, it reminds me of something," and they're like, "Don't breathe it in too hard; it'll do damage." I remember Prague as being gray, talking about colors and memory, gray, almost like a dusty jewel, but sparked by that. When you're walking around at night and you'd see the tram lines create that blue spark, and that's a mental image of the color and what I see there. I also really remember the difference in clothing, and you mentioned this before, talking about there seemed to be a very almost like a uniform that most Czech people wore at that time, and with the influence of the Americans and the opening of the walls, you could see every young person suddenly had access to MTV, and they knew how to dress. You know, so you could tell the difference between that, and that's a big memory for me of what Prague was like in that time.
To that, I would just add, I remember the river, the Vltava, and the nightlife that was happening along the river, and just the sort of joy that one found just strolling around the city in the evenings, street performances, concerts. I remember going to this wonderful restaurant. I couldn't remember the name of it now, where we were sitting on the roof, overlooking a square, and it was idyllic. I mean, it was really just it was just buzzing with an energy that stayed with me. Just thinking about those strolls. I mean, you could still walk across the Charles Bridge and not be crushed by tourists at that time, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was, and I remember walking the streets in the evenings and in the mornings when it was, still you didn't have that crush of people like you have now, yeah, just the architecture, the spires. That's what I remember.
Well, the thing that struck me was in almost every dealing that I had, there was this amazing tension between people who, by whatever they had set up to do, were aspiring to something interesting. And as soon as you got to the details, it was impossible. So whenever I confronted that all the time, it was the most frustrating thing to me. So there would be opportunity, opportunity, opportunity. Let's try and realize that, oh, it's impossible.
Okay. Neexistuje.
All right, and that was, that was maybe the most salient thing to me. And in some sense, it took it as my job to try and figure out how to take the aspiration and get it to execute without the belief that it was impossible. And that really became a thing I got trained in, and I exercise today.
With Czechs or?
With people.
I remember a bit of that as well, that after 50 years of communism, it's easy to see why ideas and opportunities could be squashed. And so the idea is, that's not going to happen. And I remember as we were setting up our legal structure for the Globe, I remember this vividly, walking across Václavské náměstí with our lawyer. And we said, we'd like to do this, and then we'd also like to set up a foundation so we could put some of the profits toward charity. And he looked at me and he said, why don't you make some profits first? And it was like, and suddenly we realized he doesn't believe in us.
Yeah.
My interactions day to day were probably more with government people, and I found them to be almost very skilled in the way in which they handled American government officials and bureau. I mean, they probably had a lot of training, in this, and they were very efficient in their meetings, very practical, and I remember just being impressed with how receptive and ready they were to really turn the page. I mean, one of the things that amazed me most about Prague was how quickly communism had appeared to have been just thrown off, as if it never happened, almost, as if it were just sort of this. I mean, it obviously had a huge impact on the society, but it was almost like it had been in the works for a long time, and if I didn't know the history at all, it would have been hard to believe that it had been under communist rule for that long.
Yeah, if I can add to that, another thing that I'm remembering now is how in early 1991 how everyone wanted to talk to me. And they wanted to talk to me in English. I couldn't speak anything else anyway, but they really wanted a Czech lesson in essence. And that's how I thought, oh, we're so popular. Everybody wants to invite us to their home for dinner or for this or that. And I realized eventually, maybe we were interesting, maybe, but mostly they were super excited to practice English, even if they really didn't know English to practice. And so what struck me about that were two things. One, there was a real interest in me, not as a person, but me as a foreigner, and trying to understand. So how do you think about money? How do you think about economics? How do you make decisions? This sort of thing. And also a real openness, because I wouldn't invite a stranger in, even if I wanted to learn Czech or anything else, to my home. But people, that's what they did. And they were extremely generous, but in this funny, transactional way. And it took me forever to figure that out. I felt really welcomed at the same time as being somehow taken advantage of.
A little exploited.
That's right.
Yeah.
In the relatively short time I was there, managed to meet a pretty wide circle of American expats who I hung out with. But probably the person I spent the most time with was the embassy's interpreter, a guy named Jan Sternad, who was at one time a state television news anchor. And he was just a fantastic guide to Prague, and he would bring me to these bars in the working class neighborhood. I think it was Šmíchov, and we would drink Staropraminas and eat smažený sír, and it's just stuff like that. And he was my connection into the Czech culture. Really, I had a lot of great times with him.
Cool. Actually, we have some picture of you socializing on the right side, or that's some party, but could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a picture of the July 4th party at the U.S. Embassy in 1993, and what I remember most about that day was the day that I met Václav Havel, and I certainly was aware of his pivotal role in the Velvet Revolution, and he was the conscience of the nation. I wish I shook his hand. I wish I would have said something, meaningful to him. But I was 26, and, but that was sort of I guess a typical day in the life of the U.S. Embassy in Prague in 1993. It was really a lot about networking and getting to know Czechs in the government and facilitating U.S. foreign investment. At times, I felt like our main job was sort of to be cheerleaders for the Czech economy and privatization program, and so that's what the embassy officials are out there doing, is really. There was a sort of sense of competition a little bit with other countries that were rapidly embracing the Czech Republic, Germany first and foremost. Nobody was worried about, Russia anymore or anything like that. But that was a special day. I'll tell two quick stories. This picture, this is on this day, my official duty was to get President Jimmy Carter, who was visiting, a drink. And that's me on the left. And I'm shaking his hand, I think. And I remember asking him, Mr. President, can I get you a drink? And he thought about it. He said, I'll have a beer. No, I'll have some wine. No, I'll have a beer. I'll have some wine. And then his wife jumps in and said, he'll have a beer. Off I went. That was Rosalind. The other story that stands out in my mind from that time. I don't have a picture of it, but I was sent with Jan, my friend, the translator, to Prostějov in June of '93 for a meeting of the Czech Communist Party of Bohemian and Moravia.
Wow.
And the embassy basically wanted to have some observers there. And there was this schism going on in the party, right? There was a reformist wing that wanted to sort of introduce socialist reform, and then there was a wing that wanted to go back to the past and just, you know, back to the old regime. And so there was this huge schism debate going on within the party. And we drove down to Prostějov in Jan's beat-up Škoda, which I think hit a top speed of 40 miles an hour. And I remember being passed by all these gleaming Mercedes with German license plates along the way, just zipping by us. But we got to Prostějov, and I had already managed to make some Czech friends, one of whom lived in Prostějov and took us out the night we got there. So the next day we got to the Communist Party meeting, and Jan and I were both feeling pretty bad. And to make matters worse, there was just this everybody was smoking there. I mean, it was just, you know, there's this intense debate going on. I had never seen so many people smoking at the same time, and it just never stopped. It was just suffocating. And I'm sure those were really like bad cigarettes too, you know, unfiltered. But you couldn't step outside for air because there was this huge crowd of people waiting to throw eggs at whoever stepped out of the meeting hall, because they thought we were, you know, communists, and they were ready to hit us. And I remember stepping out, and then, you know, these eggs just exploding around us, and I got some yolk on my shirt, and this crowd was just, you know.
So you said 1993,
1993,
right? Wow.
Yeah. I mean, that it was the feelings were very bitter still, you know.
So I hung out with a lot of Americans and basically English-speaking people from everywhere around the world. So the Globe attracted Canadians and Danes, Scandinavians, lots of Czechs. I ended up marrying a Russian. Just lots of, we had a Filipino in the kitchen. It was very international at the Globe.
Wow.
I hung out with a lot of English-speaking people who were better than me interested in integrating with Czech people. And so by one removed, I hung out a lot with Czechs. So for example, I hear privatization a lot. So I spent a lot of time with Martin. I can't remember his last name. I was just looking it up. Who was the mathematician graduate student who one day was told, hey, you need to model what the new financial system is going to be. You have to figure out what coupon privatization is going to be. Can you do that? And so I remember him coming, talking to me and saying, like, how does, what incentivizes people? And oh, yes, some nice people from Germany came and met me today, and they were offering me, or they gave me a fax machine. I said, you can't take the fax machine, Martin. And so on. And he'd say, why? And someone's offered me a car. And he'd say, they're so nice to me. And we'd have to explain to Martin, they actually want information from you. And another person's Jenik Koper, who I think I sent you a photo of, who looks like the original nerd. So he was at ČVUT. He was a computer scientist, and one of the things he modeled was weather. And the reason he modeled weather was because he wanted to make the Czech manufacture of electricity efficient. So if it's going to be cold, you want to make more electricity, and if it's going to be a hot day, less electricity, and so on. And he kind of did it from his grandmother's bedroom, right? But he wrote this very sophisticated software. And so I got to interact with a lot of people who had serious impact or serious potential impact on what the nation would end up doing. But they were just like regular people who had a particular skill and were so, beautifully naive in a sense about what they were doing, and very pure about what they were doing. He wasn't trying to get rich. He just thought, it really makes sense if we made electricity in a sensible way. So that's what he was trying to do. He had no angle on how to make this any better than the country should use electricity in an effective way. So I really felt privileged to hang out with a lot of people who did things that really impacted the Czech nation. And they did it because they were just interested and skilled people. So that's Mila, who's a scientist from Granada, and I actually just published a paper with her and her graduate student.
Right now, like this year?
Just this year. So this was a relationship that got forged a long time ago. And now I am engaged not only with her activities, but her graduate students' activities.
Okay.
And to me, that's sort of what happened there. I met a lot of people who became people who did semi-significant things and created a global network of people I still communicate with and even produce things with.
Yeah, cool.
I loved Bunker.
Bunker, okay,
Yeah, I went
so I'm
there
glad I have it.
all the time.
Yeah, because
We all did.
Yeah, you still all went there.
I think that was on the embassy's no-go list. So
So you didn't...
I don't know
I
how
think you
long.
mentioned the ska music, right? So did
Yeah,
you...
yeah. I went. Do you remember ska? The ska
sure.
scene. So there was a band, a famous Czech ska band that I went to see called Stožvirat.
Stozvirat,
Yeah,
yeah.
Zvirat.
Actually, I have some music here. I will play it during the social.
It was.
So-
I had no idea what I was getting into, and but it was just this amazingly, energetic music, and the people there were just so into it. And I was later told that this was a legendary band, that had its start before the Velvet Revolution. And I mean, music played such an important role in the revolution. I guess starting, but even before that, with the arrest of the plastic people of the universe, and the formation of Charter 77. So to just get a taste of that scene in Prague was something. It wasn't only fun, but it was a taste of history. You really got a sense of what that meant to the culture and to the country.
I remember Stozvirat as well, very much.
Maybe you
And
were in the same
Bunker,
crowd without knowing about that.
Probably.
Any theaters you went to, or anything?
I'd love to go to the opera.
To
we
Národní divadlo or Státní opera?
All of them. For 25 crowns, we could go sit in a balcony. I mean, it was wonderful. So I tried to see everything that came through.
What I loved was going to the opera and then to Bunker. And you could do that. And I remember trying desperately to meet Milan Hlavsa of Pool Notes. And so I would go like over and over whenever there was a sighting or whenever Pool Notes would play. I don't know what I wanted to say to him, but I really wanted to meet him. Yeah. And one day I did, over warm beer, and he really didn't have that much to say.
Yeah.
But he's,
That's why he was a musician.
Right. He was amazingly non-conversational, and I'm a pretty charming guy. But he didn't treat me with disdain. It just he to me was this icon of change and cultural force, and it was it actually made me realize that he did that not by chatting, right? That wasn't like
Obviously.
where his power came from, and that was a lesson to me.
Cool. Do you have anything?
When you were talking about the opera, it just reminded me that I was able to go once with the ambassador and his wife invited me to in their box to see Jenufa by Janacek. And I just remember, it was a fantastic experience. And after the opera, we went to dinner with the cast. and I sat across from the soprano. But it was a pretty dark opera. I mean, there was a baby who died, and it it was described as, I remember, as unsentimental realism, which to me sort of captured the Czech character at that time. Unsentimental realism.
We are really good at that. Yeah.
I guess I already jumped the gun on this question. But I mean, Havel was by far the most,
And you also mentioned to me you did like interviews with some of the Czech politicians who were behind the coupon privatization.
Yeah, those were sort of junior level people. They didn't trust me to meet with any of the big, the head people. But and I wouldn't remember their names now. But mid-level officials, again, who all impressed me greatly with their capability and their intelligence, and they basically said what American officials needed to hear, and then they probably did whatever it is they needed to do on their end. Yeah. So I don't recall their names, but there's some economists who were very insightful about what was happening with privatization, and I remember I wrote a report that was somewhat pessimistic in the longer term about the large-scale privatization program, and based on my discussions with these economists and the embassy, some folks in the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service who were trying to attract foreign investment wanted to kind of squash my cable because they thought it was not optimistic enough, but my boss let it go through without changes. I mean, he was, which I really appreciated. Mm-hmm. So,
And you also wrote a thesis, right? In the end?
Yeah. It's pretty boring stuff. I mean, but it was, at the time it was very novel, that approach to privatization. A lot of it had to do with just the legacy, the political legacy, and the industrial legacy of the country, and it was a sweeping program. And it was effective at first. I think over time, it became subject to some corruption, But
What about you, Maura? Or do you have anything to add?
I saw Václav Havel dancing.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. At your
across the room.
At your place at the Globe, or
no, we didn't have dancing there.
Yeah.
We didn't have any famous politicians really come in, but we did have a lot of famous authors who either wandered in or we asked them to come in. Allen Ginsberg was there. He gave a reading. He said we had a very slim poetry section. We had Richard Ford also came in one time, and we recognized him and asked him if he would do a reading, and he said he was leaving town the next day, but he said, I'll just do it right here. And so we called everyone's attention, everyone who happened to be in the bookstore at the time. He set up a table, and he read from his latest book. Amy Tan was there. We had a lot of Czech authors, too, come in. Joachim Topol. I'm trying to remember some of them.
That's okay. This is not a test.
I was there at that Ginsberg reading.
Were you?
Yeah. Cool.
I ate a lot of smažený syr. Like
typical
a lot
pub
of it.
Meal, right? That's
Yes.
what they have in every hospital.
Because I was a vegetarian.
Yeah.
And so that's
the most
the thing
vegetarian
to eat.
meat. Yeah, food.
So that's Vladislav Mareš and his wife Susanna Mareš. And he's a very educated, he ran a department at the laboratory, he was a histologist. And so he thought it was very quaint that I was a vegetarian, for example. And he said, let me explain to you Czech cuisine. It's really a peasant cuisine. And we couldn't afford meat. So it's mostly vegetarian. So every Monday night, I think, we would go to his place with our laundry, wash the laundry. And he would teach me to make vegetarian, peasant food from his grandmother's cookbook, which was handwritten and he'd say it's written in German or some old style Czech and so on. So that's how I learned about Czech culture. That place fed me almost half of my time, so maybe 5 years of food was eaten at that place. It's Medusa. And
that's Medusa.
I could go there at a little bit after midnight because I would catch the 11:38 bus from the Institute. It would get me to Medusa, which was in, where did I live? Near, I can't remember.
Close to Národní divadlo, basically.
Yeah, not too far
that
from,
area, yeah.
from there. And Vinohradska. And they would have whatever leftover pierogi, they would serve me, and that's what I would eat almost every night, unless there were no pierogi, in which case I just drank beer.
Okay. So after the Globe opened, I was able to have a lot of salad. I was also a vegetarian when I went over. I actually had my son in Prague, so when I got pregnant, suddenly I didn't want to be a vegetarian anymore. But when I first went over, and I remember ordering a vegetarianska omeleta or something, and it came with ham.
Vegetarian. That's very Czech, actually.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh. So
I ate whatever was on offer in the embassy, cafeteria. But I remember a lot of dumplings, a lot of just meat and gravy and smazheny syr, and it was not a healthy summer, I would say, diet-wise. Yeah. If I could have stayed longer, I would have. It was a combination of having no money and having to go back to school.
Yeah.
But I loved every minute of it. I mean, I would have stayed if I could have.
And you, Maura, did you stay as long as you expected, or?
I went over thinking that I would stay for 3 to 6 months and then go to graduate school, and I ended up staying 4+ years.
Oh, yeah. And you brought a son from there, right?
Brought a son back, who just graduated from college this weekend. Wow. He's actually in, if you go back to one of those pictures, you can see a stroller. That's him right there.
Ta-da.
That's my ex-husband.
That's the Russian.
You were productive.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I thought I'd be there 6 months. The first time I was there, it was 18 months. Then I thought I would go back. I really didn't know how long I would be there, and that was in 1997. And I stayed until really 2005, I think. And I never officially planned to leave. I just sort of stopped going.
Yeah, so you're basically still there in.
And I'm starting to go back.
Yeah, can you tell a bit more about that?
Well, so one of the things that my role there was to, in some sense, rejuvenate and help train the next generation of Czech scientists, of physiologists. And so we did that, and they went around the world and got trained in laboratories in New York, in Norway, in Austria. And what's impressive is many of them, not all, like your husband, but not all of them most of them wanted to return to Prague and live in the Czech Republic. So they are doing that. And they're now establishing their own research programs and so on. And as they mature, we have intellectual ties that we now exploit.
Some of my best friends are people who I knew in Prague. So I keep in touch with a lot of people who I met there.
Are they mostly Czechs or Americans or both?
Both.
Okay. What about you?
I'm not, unfortunately. Probably a function of the shorter period of time I spent there as well. And State Department people are really good at covering their tracks, too. They go off and, do all these different posts. And I dropped out of touch with Jan, unfortunately. But it's hard to Google Jan Sterna.
There are many of them, but...
It's like Rob Lewis. Minimal in my case. Yeah, I mean, I was very intrigued by the language. I would have loved to have the opportunity to study it more, but I was in a bubble too in the U.S. Embassy. I mean, it was just a few phrases.
Yeah. You, Maura?
We were in a bit of a bubble at the Globe as well, with lots of Czechs wanting to speak English. But I learned some Czech. I could get around. Yeah. I could say which I'm very proud of.
That is impressive. Yeah.
So I never took any Czech lessons. I spent a long time there. And so people would joke that I was Prague's most educated moron because I would speak. I conducted, I negotiated things in Czech. I ran a department in the Academy of Sciences without properly speaking Czech, but I would say, food, eat, hunger, good, that kind of thing. I even, in fact, you reminded me, the picture of Zdeněk there. So later that same night, I ended up having to, this is the best story, but negotiating with maybe 20 skinheads not to beat me up in Czech. And what's interesting is I made the argument to them that I was really good for their country because I was going to connect a lot of Czech people to international science, which turned out to be true, but I managed to do it without knowing how to speak Czech.
I wonder if Maura could talk about the early days of the Prague Post. Were you there at that time?
I was, when it was a very small office, at the first office that was there, and Lisa Frankenberg-Leshny, who is going to be here tonight, had founded it, and I don't know the details about the founding, but when I went over there, I was a reporter and was working with editors, mostly young people. There were a couple of people who came over and were kind of like the grown-ups in the room, who had come from, kind of a second career type thing. They had perhaps taught and then came over and they were editing the kids' stories.
Were they from Berkeley?
They were from Berkeley. There was a whole contingent that came to Prague from Berkeley.
Long time no see, Mr. Lewis. I was on the Marine contingent that used to be at your embassy way back when.
Really?
And yes, bunker was off limits to us.
You guys had a lot of off-limits places. Wow, I remember you guys. Yeah.
But
That's wild.
my question for you is, you've shared some of the wonderful experiences that you had. What were some of the more questionable experiences?
I'm sure there was a lot happening there under the surface that I wasn't privy to, I wasn't aware of. I think I mentioned that I had written some things that were sort of somewhat critical about the approach that the government was taking to the coupon privatization, just sort of the potential longer-term effects and how much resistance that met with from within certain parts of the U.S. Embassy that really wanted to be sure to paint a very rosy picture of the economy to potential investors. And there was just sort of this sort of consensus that this was the direction that we had to go. And but it was just based on my conversations with economists and government people. I'd be interested in what others who may have had experience participating in that program think. I mean, the jury is in a way still out on it. I think I read a statistic that 62% of Czech GDP is generated by foreign companies these days. Wages are a third lower than in neighboring European countries because so much of the investment is flowing back out to those companies. So, on the one hand, it was a great success in privatizing a large segment of the economy very quickly. But then the question was, well, who's controlling those shares really? And so that kind of got papered over a bit. And then ultimately in 1997, it brought a government down, the corruption that resulted from that. And Havel was extremely critical of that program, in large part. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that he had a rivalry with Václav Klaus, and I mean, Klaus was brilliant at designing that program and executing it, but Havel had a lot of reservations about the fallout from it, and in some respects he was proven right. So yeah, but it's hard to point to anything nefarious happening, because it was a very hopeful, optimistic time.